The morning of March 14, 1943, arrived with the suffocating humidity that had become synonymous with death throughout the New Guinea campaign. Major Hideki Yamamoto stood on the improvised observation platform overlooking Wewak airfield, watching columns of black smoke rise from the harbor where the transport ship Tatekawa Maru burned like a funeral pyre against the jade waters of Hansa Bay. The vessel had carried the last scheduled supply run from Rabaul, its holds loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement personnel for the 18th Army's increasingly desperate defensive positions scattered across New Guinea's northern coast. The Tatekawa Maru had been destroyed by American P-38 Lightning fighters from the 5th Air Force, their twin-engine silhouettes clearly visible as they climbed away from the burning transport toward their base at Port Moresby. Major Yamamoto counted 8 aircraft in the formation, flying with the casual confidence of pilots who operated in completely controlled airspace. No Japanese fighters had risen to challenge the American attack, because no operational Japanese aircraft remained at Wewak airfield after 3 months of sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Behind Yamamoto, the remnants of the 78th Infantry Regiment occupied positions that stretched along 15 kilometers of coastline, their foxholes and defensive bunkers carved into coral ridges that provided excellent protection against naval bombardment but offered no concealment from aerial observation. The regiment had arrived on New Guinea in January 1943 with full strength of 3,847 officers and men, equipped with the latest Japanese military equipment and carrying sufficient supplies for extended combat operations against Allied forces advancing from Australian bases. Now, 10 weeks later, the 78th Infantry Regiment counted fewer than 1,200 effectives, the remainder having become casualties of disease, malnutrition, and the relentless aerial bombardment that characterized Allied operations throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. The regimental aid station treated an average of 40 cases of malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers each day, but medical supplies had been exhausted since the beginning of March when the previous transport convoy had been intercepted and destroyed by American submarines operating between Rabaul and New Guinea. Yamamoto adjusted the focus on his field glasses and studied the burning transport ship, noting the precise location where American bombs had penetrated her cargo holds. The Tatekawa Maru was listing heavily to starboard as seawater flooded through hull damage caused by 500-pound bombs dropped by the P-38 Lightning fighters. Within 30 minutes, the transport would join the 17 other Japanese vessels that lay on the bottom of Hansa Bay, their hulks serving as monuments to Allied air and naval superiority throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. Honorable Major, called Sergeant Koizumi from the base of the observation platform, his voice carrying the formal respect that Japanese military protocol demanded even under desperate circumstances. Koizumi had served as Yamamoto's communications specialist since the beginning of the New Guinea campaign, maintaining radio contact with other elements of the 18th Army despite increasing difficulties with equipment maintenance and atmospheric interference that disrupted long-range transmissions. Report. Sergeant Koizumi Yamamoto lowered his field glasses and studied the map coordinates that Koizumi had recorded during the morning radio intercept session. The 78th Infantry Regiment maintained continuous monitoring of Allied radio transmissions, though Japanese cryptographic capabilities had proven insufficient to decode American tactical communications encrypted with equipment that represented the latest advances in electronic warfare technology. Radio transmission from Rabaul headquarters, sir. General Adachi reports that Supply Convoy 7 Alpha has been postponed indefinitely due to Allied submarine activity along the primary shipping routes. No replacement personnel or equipment will be available for the 18th Army until further notice from Combined Fleet Headquarters. Yamamoto nodded as he absorbed the implications of Koizumi's report. Supply Convoy 7 Alpha had represented the 18th Army's final hope for receiving ammunition, food, and medical supplies adequate to sustain defensive operations against Allied forces that had established air superiority throughout the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. The postponement of the convoy meant that 350,000 Japanese soldiers scattered across New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago would be forced to continue fighting with dwindling resources against an enemy whose logistical capabilities appeared unlimited. The strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recognition since January 1943, when Imperial General Headquarters had ordered massive reinforcements to New Guinea as part of Operation Igo, designed to contain Allied advances and protect the vital shipping routes between the Dutch East Indies and the Japanese home islands. The 18th Army had received priority allocation of equipment and personnel, with entire divisions redeployed from China and Manchuria to establish defensive positions capable of repelling MacArthur's anticipated offensive operations. But the strategic assumptions underlying Operation Igo had proven fundamentally flawed, as Allied commanders had demonstrated tactical innovations that rendered traditional Japanese defensive doctrine obsolete. Instead of conducting costly frontal assaults against prepared Japanese positions, Allied forces had implemented a strategy of aerial isolation and naval interdiction that cut Japanese supply lines while avoiding direct ground combat whenever possible. Sergeant Koizumi, compile a comprehensive inventory of our remaining ammunition and medical supplies. Include projected consumption rates based on current operational requirements. Yamamoto handed his field glasses to the communications specialist while considering the arithmetic of survival that had begun to dominate tactical planning throughout the 18th Army's scattered defensive positions. The 78th Infantry Regiment possessed sufficient rifle ammunition for perhaps 2 weeks of sustained combat, assuming normal engagement rates against Allied ground forces. Artillery ammunition had been exhausted since the second week of March, when American counter-battery fire had destroyed 3 of the regiment's 475mm mountain guns along with their prepared ammunition stocks. Medical supplies consisted of bandages and antiseptic sufficient for treating minor wounds, but morphine and sulfa drugs had been unavailable since the beginning of February. Yamamoto studied the tactical map that showed Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater, noting the systematic progression of airfields that American engineers had constructed to support their aerial interdiction campaign. Port Moresby had been transformed into a major airbase housing more than 200 combat aircraft, including B-25 Mitchell bombers capable of attacking Japanese shipping throughout the Bismarck Sea. Additional airfields at Dobadura and Papandetta provided forward bases for fighter aircraft that maintained continuous patrol coverage over Japanese supply routes. The 5th Air Force had achieved complete aerial supremacy over New Guinea through a combination of superior aircraft performance, overwhelming numerical advantage, and tactical coordination that reflected American industrial and technological capabilities. Japanese aircraft production had proven insufficient to replace combat losses, while pilot training programs could not produce replacement aircrew with the experience necessary to match American pilots who possessed extensive combat experience and unlimited fuel for training flights. At 0930 hours, Yamamoto received radio confirmation that the Tatekawa Maru had sunk in 37 meters of water, taking with her 847 tons of supplies intended for distribution among the 18th Army's forward positions. The transport had been the 18th Japanese vessel lost during March, bringing total shipping losses since January to more than 45,000 tons of cargo capacity that could not be replaced within the operational timeline required to sustain defensive operations against Allied advances. The sinking of the Tatekawa Maru represented more than tactical inconvenience or logistical disruption. It marked the completion of a strategic trap that had been developing since the Allied victory at Guadalcanal had enabled MacArthur's forces to transition from defensive to offensive operations throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. The 350,000 Japanese soldiers positioned throughout New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago had become isolated garrison forces, cut off from resupply and reinforcement by Allied air and naval superiority that made conventional shipping operations impossible. "Sir," Koizumi said quietly, studying the radio intercept logs that contained fragmentary reports from other elements of the 18th Army. Colonel Matsuda reports similar supply difficulties at Madong. The 41st Infantry Regiment has received no resupply since February 28. Lieutenant Colonel Hayashi requests permission to implement emergency rationing procedures for the 51st Infantry Regiment at Salamaua. Yamamoto reviewed the reports with growing understanding of the strategic reality that Japanese commanders had been reluctant to acknowledge. The 18th Army was not conducting defensive operations designed to repel Allied advances while maintaining secure supply lines to Japanese-controlled territory. They were fighting a battle of attrition while completely cut off from logistical support, dependent on local resources insufficient to sustain 350,000 men engaged in combat operations against an enemy with unlimited access to supplies and reinforcements. The Allied strategy had achieved strategic objectives through tactical methods that avoided the costly frontal assaults traditionally associated with Pacific theater operations. Instead of attacking Japanese defensive positions directly, Allied forces had used air superiority and naval mobility to isolate Japanese garrisons while establishing their own forward bases within range of Japanese supply lines. The result was a form of siege warfare conducted on a strategic scale, where entire armies were gradually weakened through supply interdiction rather than direct combat. Yamamoto climbed down from the observation platform and walked among the defensive positions occupied by the 78th Infantry Regiment, noting the physical deterioration that had become evident among his men during the past month. Soldiers who had arrived on New Guinea weighing an average of 60 kilograms now weighed perhaps 45 kilograms, their faces gaunt with malnutrition and their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost muscle mass despite continued combat duties. The tropical diseases that flourished in New Guinea's climate had proven as effective as Allied weapons in reducing Japanese combat strength. Malaria afflicted more than 60% of the regiment's personnel, with daily fever cycles that prevented sustained physical activity. Dysentery had become endemic throughout the defensive positions, spread by inadequate sanitation facilities and contaminated water supplies that could not be properly treated without chemical purification tablets that had been unavailable since February. Tropical ulcers infected minor cuts and abrasions that refused to heal in the humid climate, creating festering wounds that became severely infected without adequate medical treatment. Beriberi caused by vitamin deficiency had begun affecting soldiers whose diet consisted primarily of rice and whatever local vegetation could be safely consumed. The combination of disease and malnutrition had reduced the 78th Infantry Regiment's combat effectiveness more than Allied bombardment or ground attacks. At 1,030 hours, American B-25 Mitchell bombers appeared over Wewak airfield, flying in formation at medium altitude while conducting their daily reconnaissance of Japanese defensive positions. The 12 aircraft maintained precise intervals and altitude discipline, their crews photographing Japanese installations with impunity while protected by fighter escorts that orbited at higher altitude. No Japanese anti-aircraft guns engaged the bombers, because ammunition for the 25mm automatic cannons had been exhausted during the previous week. Yamamoto watched the American aircraft complete their reconnaissance mission and turn south toward their base at Port Moresby, their engines creating a mechanical symphony that emphasized Allied technological superiority and unlimited fuel supplies. The bombers flew with the casual confidence of aircrew operating in completely controlled airspace, knowing that Japanese fighters could not challenge their mission even if operational aircraft remained at New Guinea's airfields. The contrast between Allied and Japanese capabilities had become starkly apparent during 3 months of continuous operations under siege conditions. Allied aircraft appeared over Japanese positions with routine regularity, conducting bombing attacks, reconnaissance missions, and supply drops to their own forward bases with systematic efficiency that reflected unlimited resources and comprehensive logistical support. Japanese aircraft had disappeared from New Guinea skies by mid-February, their bases abandoned after equipment failures and fuel shortages made continued operations impossible. Major Yamamoto, Lieutenant Ishida, called from the regimental command post, his voice carrying the urgent tone that had become associated with tactical crisis reports. Ishida served as the regiment's intelligence officer, compiling information about Allied activities based on visual observation, radio intercept data, and interrogation of local civilians who had observed American and Australian military operations. Report: Lieutenant Ishida Yamamoto entered the command post bunker, noting the detailed situation maps that Ishida had maintained despite deteriorating intelligence collection capabilities. The maps showed estimated Allied positions throughout New Guinea, based on aerial observation and radio direction, finding equipment that still functioned despite maintenance difficulties. Sir, aerial reconnaissance confirms major Allied buildup at Dobadura airfield. Estimated 150 combat aircraft now stationed within range of our positions. Additionally, intercepted radio transmissions suggest significant ground force concentration near Buna, possibly indicating preparation for offensive operations against our coastal defenses. Yamamoto studied the intelligence summary that Ishida had prepared, noting the systematic expansion of Allied air bases and ground positions that surrounded Japanese defensive areas like the closing fingers of a giant hand. The Allies had established forward positions at Buna, Dobadura, and Papandetta, creating a semicircular perimeter that blocked Japanese access to the sea while providing launching points for further advances along New Guinea's coast. The strategic implications of Allied positioning were unmistakable. Japanese forces on New Guinea had been effectively surrounded by an enemy possessing complete air and naval superiority. Supply lines to Rabaul had been severed by submarine interdiction and aerial bombardment. Communication with other Japanese garrisons had become sporadic due to equipment failures and atmospheric interference. The 350,000 Japanese soldiers scattered across New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago had been transformed from offensive combat forces into isolated garrisons fighting a defensive battle with dwindling resources against an enemy with unlimited logistical support. At 1,200 hours, the daily radio contact schedule with other elements of the 18th Army provided confirmation of the strategic reality that Yamamoto had begun to understand. Colonel Matsuda at Madong reported complete loss of artillery ammunition and medical supplies exhausted. Lieutenant Colonel Hayashi at Salamaua requested authorization to withdraw inland positions due to unsustainable casualties from aerial bombardment. Major Kurata at Finschhafen reported that his garrison had been reduced to eating palm roots and tree bark due to complete supply line failure. The pattern was consistent across every Japanese position on New Guinea. Isolated garrisons fighting with inadequate supplies against an enemy whose capabilities appeared unlimited. The strategic trap had been completed through Allied tactical innovations that avoided costly direct assaults while achieving decisive results through supply interdiction and aerial isolation. Japanese defensive positions had become prisons where entire regiments slowly died from disease, starvation, and gradual attrition under constant air attack. Lieutenant Ishida compiled detailed casualty reports from all subordinate units, include disease rates, ammunition expenditure, and projected operational capability. Based on current supply limitations, Yamamoto began planning for a defensive strategy based on reality rather than wishful thinking about supply convoys that would never arrive or reinforcements that could not reach New Guinea through Allied air and naval superiority. The arithmetic of survival had become simple and terrifying. The 78th Infantry Regiment consumed approximately 500 kilograms of rice per day to maintain minimal nutrition for 1,200 effectives. Local food sources provided perhaps 200 kilograms per day of edible vegetation, fish, and small game animals that could be captured without extensive foraging operations that exposed soldiers to Allied aerial observation. The shortfall of 300 kilograms per day would result in progressive starvation unless supply convoys resumed delivery of foodstuffs. Medical requirements were equally desperate. The regiment's aid station treated 40 patients daily for malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and combat wounds, but medical supplies consisted of bandages and antiseptic sufficient for perhaps 1 week of normal operations. Quinine for malaria treatment had been unavailable since February. Sulfa drugs for infection control had been exhausted during the first week of March. Morphine for pain relief during surgery had been rationed to emergency cases only since mid-February. Ammunition consumption exceeded supply by factors that made sustained combat operations impossible. The regiment's rifle companies possessed an average of 12 rounds per man, insufficient for one significant engagement against Allied ground forces. Machine gun ammunition had been exhausted during the previous week's defensive action against Australian patrols. Hand grenades and mortar rounds had been consumed during January and February, when Allied probing attacks had required sustained defensive fires. At 1,330 hours, Yamamoto received the final radio transmission that would define the strategic reality facing Japanese forces throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. General Adachi's headquarters at Rabaul reported that Combined Fleet had canceled all future supply convoys to New Guinea due to unsustainable shipping losses from Allied submarine and air attacks. The 18th Army was instructed to maintain defensive positions using local resources and captured enemy equipment, while awaiting strategic developments that might enable resumed logistical support. The message was bureaucratic language for abandonment. The 350,000 Japanese soldiers positioned throughout New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago had been written off by Imperial General Headquarters as acceptable losses in service of broader strategic priorities. The troops would be expected to continue fighting until death or capture, but they would receive no additional support from Japanese-controlled territory. They had become expendable assets, sacrificed to prevent Allied forces from advancing more rapidly toward objectives deemed more critical to the Japanese war effort. Yamamoto understood the strategic logic that had led to this decision. The Japanese Empire possessed insufficient shipping capacity to sustain military operations throughout the Pacific theater while maintaining supply lines to isolated garrisons that had been cut off by Allied air and naval superiority. Resources committed to futile attempts at resupplying New Guinea could be more effectively used to strengthen defensive positions closer to the Japanese home islands, where decisive battles would ultimately determine the war's outcome. But understanding the strategic logic did not diminish the immediate tactical reality facing Japanese garrison forces throughout New Guinea. They had been ordered to continue fighting with resources that were already inadequate for survival, much less sustained combat operations against Allied forces whose capabilities continued to expand as American industrial production reached peak efficiency. The garrison forces had become prisoners in an open-air camp where the bars were made of Allied air superiority and naval interdiction rather than steel and concrete. Sergeant Koizumi, Yamamoto called to his communications specialist, "Prepare message traffic to all company commanders. Conference at 1,500 hours to discuss implementation of emergency resource conservation procedures." The conference would address survival rather than tactical operations, though Yamamoto could not acknowledge this reality in official communications. The 78th Infantry Regiment would need to transition from conventional military operations to subsistence survival while maintaining the appearance of continued resistance to Allied advances. Soldiers would be required to become foragers, fishermen, and farmers while retaining their military organization and discipline. The transformation would be psychologically devastating for troops who had been trained for aggressive offensive operations and had volunteered for overseas service with expectations of glorious victory against Western colonial forces. Instead, they found themselves slowly starving in tropical isolation while watching Allied aircraft dominate the skies with impunity. The contrast between expectations and reality had already contributed to declining morale that threatened unit cohesion more than Allied military pressure. At 1,400 hours, Yamamoto climbed back onto the observation platform overlooking Wewak airfield and studied the wreckage of the Tatekawa Maru, now visible only as an oil slick on the surface of Hansa Bay where the transport had settled into 37 meters of water. The ship had carried supplies sufficient to sustain the 78th Infantry Regiment for perhaps 2 months, including ammunition, medical equipment, food stocks, and replacement personnel to offset casualties from disease and combat operations. The loss of the Tatekawa Maru represented the final severing of supply lines that had connected Japanese garrison forces to the industrial and logistical resources of their homeland. No additional transport ships would attempt the increasingly dangerous voyage from Rabaul to New Guinea through Allied-controlled waters. No aircraft would risk destruction by attempting supply drops to isolated garrisons. No submarines would attempt to penetrate Allied naval patrols that maintained constant surveillance of Japanese-held coastlines. The 350,000 Japanese soldiers scattered across New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago had become the largest prisoner-of-war population in military history, though their captors had not bothered to formally accept their surrender or provide for their welfare according to international conventions. Allied strategy had achieved the equivalent of mass capture through siege tactics implemented on a strategic scale, isolating entire armies while avoiding the casualties that direct assault would have required. When Yamamoto looked at the tactical situation maps during the afternoon company commanders' conference, he understood that his regiment occupied positions in what had effectively become a concentration camp administered by Allied air and naval forces. The perimeter was defined by Allied air superiority rather than barbed wire. The guards were American P-38 Lightning fighters and Australian destroyers rather than sentries with rifles. The prisoners were required to provide their own food, medical care, and shelter while gradually dying from disease, malnutrition, and despair. The conference lasted 3 hours as Yamamoto and his subordinate commanders developed survival protocols that acknowledged tactical realities while maintaining military protocol and unit discipline. Ammunition would be reserved for defensive actions against direct Allied assaults, with small arms fire prohibited during routine patrol contacts. Food foraging would be organized as military operations with proper security and communication procedures. Medical treatment would be prioritized based on operational requirements rather than humanitarian considerations. Each decision represented a step further away from conventional military operations and closer to pure survival mode, though the officers maintained professional terminology and tactical frameworks to preserve unit morale and military identity. The The 78th Infantry Regiment would continue to exist as a military organization even while its primary mission had changed from combat operations to subsistence survival under siege conditions. As the sun set over Wewak airfield on March 14, 1943, Yamamoto stood again on the observation platform and watched the oil slick from the sunken Tatekawa Maru spread across Hansa Bay like a dark stain against the tropical water. The transport ship had been the last tangible connection between the Japanese garrison forces and their homeland. Her destruction had completed the strategic trap that Allied commanders had been constructing since their victory at Guadalcanal had enabled transition from defensive to offensive operations. The realization came to Yamamoto with the clarity of mathematical proof. The 350,000 Japanese soldiers positioned throughout New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago were not conducting defensive operations designed to repel Allied advances while maintaining secure supply lines. They were prisoners in a vast outdoor camp, gradually dying from privation while their captors advanced systematically toward more important objectives closer to the Japanese home islands. The strategic genius of Allied tactics lay in achieving the equivalent of mass surrender without negotiation, formal capture procedures, or responsibility for prisoner welfare. Japanese garrison forces had been isolated and abandoned to die slowly from disease and starvation while tying up minimal Allied resources. The siege required only air patrols and naval interdiction to maintain, freeing most Allied ground forces for offensive operations against targets with greater strategic significance. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Campaign had implemented strategic deception on a scale that dwarfed tactical innovations. Japanese commanders had been encouraged to reinforce New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago through carefully orchestrated intelligence operations that suggested Allied intentions to conduct costly frontal assaults against prepared defensive positions. In reality, Allied strategy had always intended to isolate Japanese garrisons while advancing along different routes toward the Japanese home islands. The 350,000 Japanese soldiers had been lured into a strategic trap that resembled the ancient tactic of leading enemy forces into terrain where they could be surrounded and systematically destroyed through siege warfare. But instead of a single battlefield, the trap encompassed thousands of square miles of tropical territory where entire armies had been isolated from logistical support and abandoned to their fate by commanders who had more pressing strategic priorities. During the weeks and months that followed March 14, 1943, the strategic trap would tighten as Allied air and naval superiority prevented any possibility of resupply or reinforcement for Japanese garrison forces throughout New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago. Disease and malnutrition would kill more Japanese soldiers than Allied weapons, as tropical conditions accelerated the effects of inadequate food supplies and non-existent medical care. The 78th Infantry Regiment would continue to exist as a military organization until the end of the war, though its strength would decline steadily from disease, starvation, and the psychological effects of complete isolation from the outside world. Most of the soldiers would die on New Guinea, their bodies buried in unmarked graves throughout the jungle terrain where they had been abandoned by strategic decisions made in Tokyo and Washington. For Major Yamamoto and the survivors of the 18th Army, the sight of the last transport burning in Hansa Bay would remain the defining moment when they realized that 350,000 Japanese soldiers had been trapped on New Guinea in the largest prisoner-of-war camp in military history, administered by Allied air superiority and naval interdiction rather than conventional guards and barbed wire enclosures. The strategic trap had been completed with devastating efficiency, achieving decisive results while minimizing Allied casualties and freeing resources for operations with greater strategic significance. The Japanese garrison forces would continue to tie up Allied surveillance assets until the end of the war, but they would never again threaten Allied advances toward objectives that could influence the conflict's ultimate outcome. In the vast expanse of New Guinea's jungle terrain, where the bones of 350,000 Japanese soldiers would eventually bleach under the tropical sun, the wreckage of the Tatekawa Maru served as a monument to strategic deception implemented on a scale that transformed entire armies into abandoned prisoners, dying slowly in an outdoor concentration camp that stretched across thousands of miles of Allied-controlled territory. The morning of March 14, 1943, had marked the completion of one of the most successful siege operations in military history, though the besieged garrison forces would not surrender formally until August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast finally informed them that their war had ended 2 years after they had become prisoners in all but name.